Breaking news. Russia's use of traditional values in foreign policy is a strategic move. Paradoxically, the fierce religious conservatism of 21st-century Russia echoes the Soviet anti-religious socialism of the 20th. Their shared characteristic is the open and willing use of religion as an instrument. Alexander III, Russia's Tsar at the time, is rumored to have said something along the lines of, "Russia has only two allies, its army and navy." Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, who exercises absolute power, appears to agree with this idiom. In 2017, he dedicated a monument to Alexander III in occupied Crimea with this inscription. Putin's style of leadership, however, calls for a slight modification of this saying. Russia has only two allies, its hard and soft powers. From Chechnya to Georgia to Syria to Ukraine, Vladimir Putin has been deploying the Russian armed forces ever since he took office as president. Between hard and soft power, he came to understand that energy, oil and gas, is a potent weapon. At some point, the Russian president began to use culture, religion, and ideals as weapons. Putin approved a decree updating the legally binding Basics of the State Culture Policy in January 2023. This edict declares Russia's cultural sovereignty to be founded on spiritual and moral values. In keeping with this hypothesis, Russian media frames the conflict in Ukraine as a fight to defend these spiritual and moral values against the supposed assaults of the decadent and liberal West. Some Western Christian conservatives appear to have bought onto this interpretation. Recent edition of First Things features church historian Matthew Dal Santo praising Russia for a achievement. Holy Russ is often mentioned in public conversation because it represents a spiritual purpose and norm for public life in Russian culture. When compared to the too rigid political atheism of the West, Russian culture comes closer to the reality on this point. This perspective is quite simplistic and naive. Christianity has had a profound influence on Russian culture. On the other hand, it frequently twists these concepts by supporting anti-Semitism and, more lately, anti-Ukrainism as kinds of exclusivism. My country's civil war may be traced back to this idea that religion-based, traditional values are at the root of the problem. However, the Russian state's invocation of so-called traditional values is founded on the wholly secular concept that moral lessons may be divorced from religion, and as a result, these values have been emptied of any religious significance and have become a blunt instrument of the Russian state. What we call traditional values. The Kremlin has appropriated the Russian Orthodox Church's concept of spiritual and moral values, also known as traditional values, for its own ends. See his collected essays Freedom and Responsibility: A Search for Harmony, Human Rights and Personal Dignity for more on how Patriarch Kirill of Moscow spread the concept of values in the 1970s. The concept of values was developed by academics like American sociologist Talcott Parsons at the height of secularization efforts in the West. In a secular society, they argued, values can be separated from religion and shared. As religion in the West fought for its presence in public life, this middle ground between ideological secularism and religion was welcome. A talented young Russian bishop named Kirill Gundyaev wondered if the concept of values might be introduced to the Soviet Union. When compared to what was happening behind the Iron Curtain, the secularization process in the West was far more gradual. Soviet Russia advocated an extremely severe and brutal secularism that aimed to eradicate religion from public and private areas, in contrast to the Western nations' more lenient approach to religious freedom. Kirill hoped that the idea of values would help the Russian Orthodox Church gain some small amount of popular recognition in the Soviet Union. Russian culture. The 2009 patriarchal accession of Kirill marked the beginning of this plan. However, traditional values were already obsolete by the time militant atheism became a threat. Instead, the concept of values was reworked to provide support for the idea of a special Russian civilization, or what I like to term, civilizational exceptionalism, on the part of the Russians. As a matter of fact, I would suggest that Russian civilizational exceptionalism is the preeminent state ideology through which the Kremlin justifies its war in Ukraine and tries to convince the Russian people to embrace this conflict. There are spiritual undertones to Russia's claim of civilizational superiority. Its co-demiurges include Patriarch Kirill and other religious leaders, philosophers, and theologians. The founders of Russian exceptionalism were influenced by ideas from the American School of Sociology, particularly the concept of values, and by Samuel P. Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. Despite Huntington's lack of interest in the possibility of a Russian civilization, his Russian followers hold that view. Russia's theory of its own civilization's exceptionalism finds theoretical validity in Huntington's thesis. These Russians are particularly fond of the notion that religious traditions provide a framework for civilizations according to the Huntingtonian perspective. Here's how their plan works. Russia is not an ethnic group but rather a supra-ethnic group consisting of numerous different ethnic groups. They have a shared history, language, and faith. There are many major world religions, with Orthodox Christianity being the most prominent. Traditional religions of the people of Russia include Islam, Judaism, and Buddhism, among others. There are others who believe that Russia's strong gravitational field is something that few other states can match. The United States and a few of other Western countries have similar gravity. They can drag other planets and stars into their orbits and devour them like gigantic stars. Putin thinks the constellation of Western superstates kidnapped Ukraine, the largest and most valuable planet in the Russian solar system, along with numerous other planets. Russia and Ukraine are independent countries. Putin defines Russia's gravity as national sovereignty. He sees Ukraine's move toward the West as an attack on his country's independence, which is why he rails against what he assumes to be Western neo-imperialism and NATO's aggressive violations of Russian territory. The majority of Ukrainians view NATO's infringements in a different light. Think of a ruler in the Orient who is polygamous, violent, and spoiled. He was able to bask in the glory of his harem without any opposition for quite some time. Most of his wives and concubines were held against their choice and had nowhere to go. At some point, a structure was built to the west of the tyrant's domain. The peoples who once belonged to the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union and who have been tormented by Putin's state see NATO as a safe place where they may flee from their abusive master, regardless of the original motivations that led to the creation of the organization. The master may view the institution that houses his former wives and concubines as a safe haven for those who are just interested in stealing from him. Putin's view of Ukraine's relationship with the West and the Ukrainian perspective are poles apart. The former view the Ukrainians as something to be owned. Ukrainians, on the other hand, think they have a soul and a will of their own. They consider it a perfectly legitimate act of self-determination to take refuge in NATO and the European Union. Putin has consistently rejected any notion of Ukrainian independence. For him, only an imperial tint to sovereignty will do. Putin, on the other hand, never uses the word empire to describe the West. However, he uses the term civilization when referring to Russia. In his context, this word is a synonym for empire. Religion as an instrument. Putin and his followers believe that Russian culture is incomparable to any other. The truth of its religion, he argues, makes it superior to both the secularism of the West and the unorthodox beliefs of those who seek to eliminate Russia from the international stage. Putin has been convinced by the leaders of the Russian Orthodox Church that Russia's Christian-based civilization will be blessed by God for its fervent defense of the faith. This concept is very Byzantine, and Putin enjoys projecting an image of himself as a basileus. This will guarantee him either tacit or overt backing from the worldwide Orthodox Christian community. Many Western Christians of different denominations either agree with or at least tolerate Putin's advocacy of traditional values. The Russian Orthodox Church and Vladimir Putin are viewed by these Christians as partners. But in Russia's eyes, they're just temporary Sputniks that serve no use. The vast majority of Russians view them as heretics. Thus, Putin's militarism is not ruled out, in the long run, to transition to fighting for particularly orthodox values once it succeeds in fighting for broad, traditional, values against liberalism. At that point, American evangelicals and conservative Catholics would be viewed not as friends but as foes, similar to how Putin's Russia already views Protestants and Catholics. Paradoxically, the fierce religious conservatism of 21st-century Russia echoes the Soviet anti-religious socialism of the 20th. Their shared characteristic is the open and willing use of religion as an instrument. Russian Orthodox Church officialdom aided the Kremlin in spreading proletarian revolution ideas, much as it does now in spreading traditional views.